Good evening again. I'm so very honored and humbled by this entire event and by the words of the speakers. And so you'll forgive me, but I have to start by thanking a number of people. I'll try not to turn this into an Oscar speech, but I need to thank a number of people. First, I want to thank Manuela Consoni, who had the idea for this event and worked so hard to make this event a reality and has been such an important part of my year here. I feel very lucky that I landed at the Vidal Sassoon Center this year, and I look forward to many years of further collaboration and learning from each other. I want to thank the whole staff of the Vidal Sassoon Center, especially both Ruchama Roth and Martina Weitz, who wears many hats. She not only offers incisive commentary, but also was very involved in the logistics for this event. And of course, I want to thank very much the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute for kindly hosting this event, and in particular, Shulamit Laron for all of her hard work in preparing the event and the publicity. Now, what can I say to the panelists? There's so much to say and so little time. First, I'm just immensely grateful to you all for reading the book with such thought and care. And I have to say that it occurred to me in thinking about this event that each of you connects to a vital phase of the trajectory that led me to this moment. Richie, I've actually known for the longest, and whether Richie remembers it or not, when I was a graduate student here at the Hebrew University for the year, we had some very fruitful conversations. The questions that he asked me about what became the third chapter of my book were actually extremely important and stayed with me for a long time. That was a very important year for me in many ways while I was here in Jerusalem. Daniel, I first met after the first time that I presented a paper at the Association for Jewish Studies. AGS has been a very important place for me, developing the ideas that went into this book. I presented versions of various chapters there, and it's a great place, I think, for cultivating people, especially early in their career. It certainly has been for me. And I have to say that Daniel did not reveal that he was one of the readers on the manuscript for the book, and not only that, he actually wrote 9 single-spaced pages of comments in response, for which I am genuinely grateful. And despite moments of perhaps less than gratitude while I was going through them and making all of the revisions, there's absolutely no question that his counsel, not only in those comments but in subsequent conversations, really made this a better book. Nono, of course, I met at the Katz Center in Philadelphia, and you asked me many questions that really challenged me to rethink especially issues of secularism and colonialism and the Sephardic experience, for which I remain grateful. And of course, Martina, you've been an important part of my year here at the Vidal Sassoon Center. You've not only made it a very collegial place to work, but also asked me good questions and pushed me in my thinking about my new research project. So I'm going to say a couple of other thank yous, and then I'll try to respond briefly. Really, there's no way I can respond in any kind of adequate way to these incredibly fruitful comments. But I do want to quickly thank especially the family that are here. My parents-in-law, Chaim and Iris Caspi, who made me feel part of their family long before they imagined I would marry their daughter. And my wife, Chagit Caspi, who is my rock, who makes me better every day, without whom none of this would be possible. And since in 2 days we will be celebrating 8 years of marriage that began right here in Israel, I will also take the liberty of saying happy anniversary. I wish that my parents and brother could be here. They are immensely supportive family as well. Okay, to try to respond to the comments, I think that Richie's point about the importance of the 19th century is fundamental, and I am very glad that he took the care to bring our attention to that. And I think that there's no question that colonialism really hovers over the book, and that 19th century history, which I didn't have enough time to go into, and has even been a complaint from some people that they wanted more historical context. The book's already 328 pages long, so I'm not sure where I would have put it, but I think it's really fundamental. Where I might, and this might get me into the second thing that I want to respond to in Richie's comments, might make me seem too optimistic, but I do want us to keep in mind that we've gone from a moment in French history where we used to write about France as this universalist republic that had its imperfections but was basically really good, to a moment where a lot of the writing in French history is about how terrible French colonialism was and how inadequate French universalism was. And while those critiques are very important, I tried for them not to take over entirely the writing of my book, because I think there is a way in which the pendulum can swing too far in the other direction, and France can become one of the so-called big baddies, just not quite as bad as the Nazis, as one colleague said to me. And so I do think it's important to keep in mind some of the optimistic strands of the civilizing mission that Richie also pointed to, and that for all of the deep abuses and faults of French colonialism in Algeria, that, as Todd Shepard has shown really well, assimilation remained the official legal policy in Algeria for almost the entire time that the French were there. And that the possibility, theoretically, that people could still become French is one of the distinctive features of French universalism historically. And I think that, for me, the heart of this story is this, this paradox, which in many moments and in many ways is even a tragic paradox, of French universalism as an ideology that has allowed people to integrate, that has opened possibilities for people becoming French, but that has also been very much wrapped up in the exclusionary discourses and exclusionary practices of France, both in its colonies and in the mainland, very much up to this day. As far as my optimism goes, Nono's going to tell me in a minute why I'm not optimistic, but for the moment I'm going to plead guilty as charged to some degree. I guess I sort of go back to something that I think Churchill said, which is, I'm an optimist because I never saw much point in being anything else. But having said that, I hope that the book doesn't come across as sort of starry-eyed in its optimism, because I think that the story that the book tells is in many ways, of course, a very sad one, even haunting in terms of moments where there were possibilities that opened and closed, and boundaries that were blurry and then hardened. And I don't think there's any question that France is living a very difficult moment today, and the France's Jews are living a very difficult moment today. And so the book in many ways tries to account for why those boundaries hardened, why that conflict has become in many ways, despite ongoing possibilities and ongoing pockets of coexistence, that conflict has become in many ways quite intractable and quite difficult to imagine, what will have to shift for things to really change in a more positive direction in the near future. I really like Daniel's thought about immigration to Israel as a new phase of decolonization. I think it's a very original idea. I wish that I could claim any credit for it. I think it's very generous of him to say that my book made him think about it. I think it requires more thought. I mean, I think that the question is whether or not that implies that sort of all living in France is defined by colonialism, right? That's my sort of hesitation with that account. And of course, there is the deeply problematic question of the relationship between colonialism and Zionism in the State of Israel, which also makes an account of that as a phase of decolonization, I think, more complex. But I think it's really worth thinking about. I think something that probably the book doesn't do enough with is this other paradox that Daniel pointed to, which is that Jews are unquestionably more integrated than Muslims in France today when we talk about structural racism and life opportunities, but that the growth of Muslim anti-Semitism in France from a group that is less integrated has made that integration much harder and has, in many cases, pushed Jews to highlight difference more, to feel less French, and has made that integration more difficult. And I think in some ways that that's such an ongoing story that it's a new chapter. Kimberly Arkin has a very good book where she deals with some of those issues, but there's I think more to be done. Martina takes me into an area that I am incredibly ignorant about, so I'm not going to say a lot about Spain for fear of saying something not very smart. But I think it's a great set of questions and comparisons, so I'll try to say a word. So first of all, I think it's just really interesting to think about the fact that, as you alluded to, this whole image of the convivencia becomes so important in Spain to the way that Jews and Muslims are seen and the way that Jews and Muslims are associated with Spain, despite this, the brutal history of the expulsions. And that clearly shapes a lot of Spanish orientation toward Jews and Muslims in the 20th century. One question that I have is it easier for that to shape Spanish orientation toward a really pretty small number of Jews and Muslims, with the exception of colonial Morocco, which still is a pretty small sliver of Morocco, than it would be if they had larger populations and larger communities that they were negotiating with on a more sustained basis? I don't know the answer to that question. I think that the comparison that you draw between what happens with the Moriscos, also what their sort of image today versus that of the Moranos, with this moment of decolonization in 1962, I think is fascinating, and I think that the inability, I think it raises a larger question, right? I think it raises a question that my book does not really deal with sufficiently, which is, how do we understand the legacies of Catholic attitudes toward Jews and Muslims in the 20th century, right? Clearly they're there. I talk about them in a few moments of the book, but that the comparison you make is very suggestive in the sense that somehow, 500 almost years later, there's a ostensibly secular, still very culturally Catholic French state that makes a set of decisions about Muslims and Jews that have this strong parallel. And the question is whether or not there are sort of cultural inheritances in terms of attitudes and images of Muslims and Jews that we have to really think more seriously about France as a Catholic country in the 20th century, which I think modernists don't think enough about, and I tried to inflect it some in the book, but I think it's something we have to think more about, and I think this calls our attention to that with regard to, including with regard to France's non-Catholic minorities. I'm going to say one more thing. Richie highlighted sort of the potentially autobiographical dimensions of the book in terms of my own outlook. And I will say just that, the grandest dreams of my book were, aside from having this wonderful event, to hopefully make people think in new ways, at least a few people in a few places, in a few conversations about the contemporary crisis of Muslims and Jews that is, of course, very central in France today, but goes well beyond France. So, I tried throughout the book, throughout the entire process, not to let my hope that the book could inflect more positive and more hopeful conversations, to not let it take over my analysis of historical evidence, which often pointed toward darker types of encounters and toward darker potential endpoints in our own time. And so the book was always written from the beginning in the shadow of crisis. I did not anticipate that the crisis would be that much worse when I finished the book than it was when I began it. But I do believe, as I say at the end of the book, that Jews and Muslims in France, in all kinds of conversations, they remind themselves, they remind people who talk to them of moments where they did not imagine themselves only as Muslims and Jews, and they did not imagine their encounters only as encounters of conflict, and that reminds us why history is so important, because history shows us in cases like this that there are multiple endpoints, that there are multiple possibilities, that contingency matters, that there are moments of historical transition, that the unexpected happens, and so in a case like this, we have to look, I believe, for how that history might help us think more imaginatively about creating the unexpected in our own time. Thank you.